guys, this is our first video lesson and notes. So I hope you all picked up your notes before you left school today and you have them with you as you are watching this video and ready to fill in. These will be put in your binders during the lesson, and when you turn in your playlist, you will turn these notes in with your playlist to get credit for your video lesson and notes. All right, so we're going to talk about two-step equations. Hopefully you are familiar with these and you have seen these before, and we're reviewing, and hopefully if you had trouble with this before, seeing it again now will help you understand it a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to talk about two-step equations and using real-life examples. So we have a school drama club. They charge $4 per person for admission to a play. The club borrowed $400 to pay for their costumes and props, and after paying back the loan, the club had a profit of $400. So we're going to know how many people attended the play for us to make $100. And when we have a real life example or a word problem, it's always important to find the important information so that we can write our equation. Okay, usually our important information is surrounded by a number. So we have some numbers in here, and let's look to see if those are all important numbers or if any of those are extra information. So $4 per person. Per is an important word because that's our operation word. Per means we either multiply or divide. If it's per person, we have to have it for each person, which means we're going to have to multiply 4 times the number of people. And since it's 4 person, not 4 times something else, our person is going to be the variable because that's what we don't know. We don't know how many people attended. So we're going to have 4 times a variable. And and our next number we see is $400. So $400, we had to borrow it. And if we borrow the money, that means we had to take away the money, right? We're not adding, taking away. So the word borrowed is also an operation word telling us to subtract. Okay, so we have $4 times a variable minus the $400. And after paying back the loan, the club has a profit of $100. So $100, if they have a profit, then they have positive money. They don't owe money, so it's not negative, but profit means they have a positive $100, so this will translate into the equation 4x minus 400 equals 100. So to solve our two-step equation, we have to use inverse operations. Okay, so here's our variable x. First, we had to multiply the 4, and then we had to subtract the 400. So inverse means to do the opposite. So if we do the opposite, we have to start at the end and work our way back to the front, right? So the last thing we did was subtract 400. So we're going to do the inverse of subtraction, which means addition. So we're adding 400. But if I add 400 on one side of the equation, I have to make it equal on the other side. So I have to add 400 on the other side of the equation as well. So I'm adding 400. This 4x, I can't add 400 to 4x. So this 4x just comes down. We're bringing it down under a line. We have a negative 400 and we add 400. This cancels out. And that's why we did the inverse operations. We wanted that to happen. And then on the other side, we have 100 plus 400 gives us 500. Okay, now we have to think about those inverse operations again. I have the variable x and I multiplied by 4. The inverse of multiplication is division. So I need to divide both sides by 4, keeping my equation equal. If I do it on one side, I have to do it on the other side. All right, so then I divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 gives me 1. 1x is the same as x. 500 divided by 4, you can do your long division, or you can put it in the calculator, and you get 125. And this is a word problem. So that number has to mean something, and that just tells us there are 125 people that attended the play. So we got to relate that back to the word problem. I'm a stickler for those word problems. They have to be labeled. 125 doesn't tell me anything about the word problem. Okay. All right, example 2, Hurricane Harvey. Before Hurricane Harvey hit, the temperature in Houston was a balmy 98 degrees. As Hurricane Harvey approached, the temperature dropped, and after Harvey died, the temperature was 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Write an equation to represent the temperature and solve for the change in temperature. All right, so first we have to find the important information. Usually it's going to be wrapped around these numbers, right? So let's highlight those numbers and something important around them. We had 98 degrees and we had 67 degrees. Okay. So we only have 2 numbers here, which is kind of weird, right? So we started at 98 degrees, and then we have these words in the middle here. I said the temperature dropped, and the question is that we want to write an equation and solve for the change in temperature. So we want to know how many degrees the temperature fell, right? So it dropped some degrees. If it dropped some degrees, then we have to subtract something. That's what we don't know, right? So here, this is telling us this is our subtracting something, subtracting a variable. We have 98 minus something. Was is the past tense of the word is. Is always tells us it's an equal sign, and it equals 67 degrees. So there's our equation from that problem. So 98 minus the temperature change is equal to, or was, 67 degrees. So we have to use our inverse operation to solve. Now when we look at this, we're looking at our variable first, right? We want to look at what's next to it. That's a positive 98, and the inverse, or the opposite of a positive 98, is a negative 98. So I have to do a negative 98 on both sides of my equation, or subtract 98. Okay, so subtraction and negative can mean the same thing. All right, so I put that negative 98 on both sides of my equal sign, and then I have to do the math straight down. 98 minus 98 is 0. It cancels out. That's what we wanted to happen, because we're going to solve for or isolate the variable. Okay, and then we're going to bring down this minus t, bring down the equals. 67 minus 98, using your integer rules or your calculator, we get negative 31. Okay, but this t, it looks like it's isolated, right? There's just a t, but there's also this negative. So a negative in front of it is like a negative 1 times t. And we want to get rid of the negative 1. So if it's negative 1 times t, we want to do the inverse and divide both sides by negative 1. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is 1, or 1. 1t is the same as t. Negative 31 divided by negative 1 is a positive 31. So we know that the temperature dropped 31 degrees. Now, also reading that problem to begin with, you might have been able to solve that way back in 2nd grade using just your operations, and you can use that to help check yourself, okay? But we want to think in terms of algebra, so we want to think in terms of equations. and you can use your other information to help you check your work. All right, example 3. I like to do an act of kindness every year for Christmas. And so I wanted to crochet, because that's I think I'm good at, right? I wanted to crochet 100 wash rags and add them to a Girl Scout soap and toiletry donation to a local charity. So this yarn that I found at Hobby Lobby costs $4.49 each, and a donation of $50 was given to me to help with the cost of this charitable work. The total cost of the project was $129.60. So we want to write an equation to represent the situation and find how many balls of yarn were purchased. All right, so we got to find that important information, right? So we got to look around those numbers and find some important words. Excuse me. So 449 I see first. Oh, that's not the right slide. Okay, let me go here so I can write. Nope. I'm fixing it for you. All right, we're gonna fix this. All right, so 449 is my important information, right? And each ball was 449. So each is a very important keyword. Each, usually in algebra, is going to mean multiply or divide, right? So in this case, it's going to mean multiply because it's going to be for each ball of yarn, and each one was 449. So we need to multiply those two things. Each ball of yarn, we don't know how many balls of yarn, so that's our variable, that's our unknown. So we're multiplying 449 times something, some variable. And so it doesn't always have to be X, even though that's the one we like, right? We want our variable to relate to the problem. So I'm going to go with either a ball, B for ball, or I could say yarn. I'm going to use a B, Y for yarn. Okay, and then I had a donation of $50. Donation means I'm adding, right? Adding a donation of $50 was given to help with costs for this charitable work. The total cost of the project is $129.60. The donation of $50. The total cost, total. Anytime you see the word total, that's another word for equals. And then our last number, 129.60. So we got our 4.49b plus 50 equals 129.60. Here's my variable. I had to multiply first and then add. So here's where I start. The opposite or the inverse of add is subtract 50. Subtract 50. Got to do it on both sides of that equal. I'm going to run out of room, I can tell. Okay, so I'm bringing down the variable. And 50 minus 50 makes a 0, so it cancels out. Bring down my equal. $129.60 minus 50. Now you notice how I wrote this minus 50? I didn't write it over here because there's that decimal, right? And I have to keep things in its place value. So 50 is really 50.00. So I wrote it over here to keep my decimal in line. All right, so if I subtract these, I get 60 cents. 9 minus 0 is 9. And then I'm going to take 12 minus 5 is 79. Okay, now I have my variable and I'm multiplying times something. So the inverse of multiply is divide. So I want to divide 449 on both sides. And you could do long division, or you can use your handy dandy calculator. I got B equals 17.72. Now B 1772, that's a decimal. In balls of yarn, that should be a whole number, right? You can only buy a whole ball of yarn at the store. So I really need to round that to a whole number. So I get B is equal to 18, or I bought 18 balls of yarn. All right, so next problem. We're just gonna have some short examples because these are the type of problems that you're gonna see most. You need to be able to have that equation and be able to solve it. Okay, so our two-step. This is our variable. We multiplied something and then we added something. So this is where we stopped. This is where we begin to undo it, right? So the opposite of plus is minus. So I'm going to have to subtract on both sides of the equation. Equal sign again. So I'm subtracting with a 7 and I'm subtracting here. My variable comes down and I rewrite my variable. 7 minus 7 is 0, so it cancels out, which is exactly what we wanted it to do. We bring down the equals, and then 19 minus 7 gives us 12. Now we have W times 3. To undo the times, we have to divide. Divide by 3 on both sides. 3 divided by 3 gives us 1. 1W is the same as W. So we have isolated our variable, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. So W is equal to 4. Okay, make sure you're writing these down in your blanks and make sure you write every single step because this is how I want you to show your work. And this is how you're going to show your work when you turn in all of your scratch paper with your playlist. All right, so sometimes our variables don't come first, like we saw in our Hurricane Harvey problem, right? So, but we always start with our variable. With our variable, I times it by 2, and then I subtracted from 3. So this is where I start to undo. The opposite or the inverse of a positive 3 is a negative 3. So I have to write a negative 3 on both sides of my equation, both sides here, left and right. Right? So remember, negative 3 is going to be just like subtracting 3. 3 minus 3 is a 0, so it cancels. I have to bring down this sign in the middle with my variable, the minus 2 in. So my minus became a negative. Bring down my equal sign, and 9 minus 3 gives me 6. Now I still have the variable in, and it's multiplied by negative 2. Opposite of multiply is divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. 1 in is the same as in. And then on the other side, I have 6 divided by -2, and that gives me 3. So my answer is n equals -3. If I'm ever going too fast for you and you can't write these down, you can always pause these videos and go back and work them out again. All right, sometimes we have decimals, and decimals are just fine. We can work with them, right? Start with your variable. I had to multiply, and then I subtracted from it. So this was my last step. The opposite of subtract is add. I'm adding 13 on both sides of the equation. So I'm having to write it down twice. Okay, my variable 2.5x has to come down. Bring it down. -13 plus 13 cancels. It's a 0. So it canceled. I just have 2.5x. Bring down the equal. 2 plus 13 is equal to 15. Now I still have my x. I had to multiply 2.5 times x. Opposite of multiply is divide. Divide both sides by 2.5. 2.5 divided by 2.5 is 1. Divide by the same number, it's always 1. 1x is the same as x. 15 divided by 2.5 using long division or your handy dandy calculator, you get 6. So x equals 6. All right. Sometimes we don't have a variable that comes first. Sometimes we just have a number on this left-hand side. But we're always going to find our variable first, find the steps that we did to our variable, and then undo those. Okay, so C was multiplied by 1/2, and then we subtracted 11, sorry. So I'm starting here. This is what I did last, right? So this is where I start. The opposite or the inverse of subtraction is addition. So I have to add 11 on both sides of the equation. -21 plus 11 gives me -10. Bring down the equals. Bring down my variable 1/2 c. -11 plus 11 gives me 0. And that cancels out. Okay, so now I have my variable. I had to multiply by 1/2, so I need to divide by 1/2. Now I'm dividing by a fraction, and when we divide by a fraction, that means I have to multiply by the reciprocal. So I can multiply by this reciprocal. Reciprocal means I take this fraction and I flip it upside down. So I flip 1/2 around. So 2 goes on top, 1 goes on bottom. 2 divided by 1. 2 divided by 1 is 2, right? So I'm having to multiply by the reciprocal, so I'm multiplying by 2. 2 is the reciprocal. Multiply by 2 on both sides. 10 times, or 2 times -10 is -20. When I'm multiplied by the reciprocal, 2 times 1 is 2. Remember, this is a 1 on the bottom. 2 times 1 on the bottom is a 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1c is the same as c. Okay. So I get the answer, -20 is equal to c. All right, these fractions, you got them. All right, so some two-step equations have some special examples. There's some very tricky ones that confuse a lot of people. Here is one of them, and then the next one is a little bit different, and a lot of them get confused. So remember to start with your variable. With that variable, I added 6 first, and then I divided by 5. Okay, so this is where I have to start. I divided by 5 last. The inverse of division is to multiply by 5. So that's what I'm doing on both sides. I multiply by 5 on both sides. Okay. When I multiply by 5 on both sides, using some cancellation here, 5 divided by 5 is 1, right? So really all I have left over, these cancel, all I have left over is what was on top of the fraction. So I have h plus 6 on my left-hand side, and then 2 times 5 is 10. Okay. Now we are going to talk about distributive property, and this is not where we use distributive property, okay? This 5 gets canceled. You do not have to multiply or divide the h plus 6 by the 5, okay? So remember, those cancel and you're left with just the top of the fraction. All right, so my equation, I had h and I added 6, opposite or the inverse of plus 6 is minus 6. So I have to do it on both sides of my equation. Don't forget to bring down your variable. Plus 6 minus 6 is 0, so it canceled. Bring down my equal. 10 minus 6 is 4. So I get the answer h equals 4. Okay, so next problem. These two problems have some confusion between them. This is different, right? Here's my variable. I'm starting with my variable. I divided it by -4, and then I subtracted. So subtracting was the last thing I did. I have to do the opposite of that first. The inverse of subtracting is adding. So first I have to add the 3 on both sides of the equation, here and here. 5 plus 3 is 8. Then I'm bringing down my whole variable part, the z divided by -4. And then -3, you're going to treat it, -3 can be treated as -3. Plus 3 gives me 0, that canceled out. Okay, now I have my variable z divided by -4, which means I have to do the opposite. I'm going to have to multiply by -4 on both sides. -4 times, I don't know if I just said that wrong, we're multiplying on both sides. -4 times 8 is -32. Negative and a positive make a negative. And over here, when I multiplied the same number, right, -4 divided by -4 is 1. So I get 1z. So I get -32 equals z, which is the same thing as z equals -32. All right, so those are all the different types of two-step equations you're ever going to see. So you have one example for each and every single one of them. Use those examples. Make sure you have all of the steps written down so you can see those steps. And you can ask questions and use those as your guides as you work through your skill check. Okay. All right, our reminders. What are the goals of conquering or building confidence in writing from a given word problem? Move so I can write this in for you. We did it in all 3 of our word problems. We had to underline or highlight. The keywords. Another word for solving is evaluate. Sorry, my pen is not working very well, so terrible handwriting. And you see that word in your notes right above your example problems. It says evaluate the following two-step equations. So we can solve or we can evaluate. Sometimes we can isolate the variables. That's another one. Isolate. Okay, so when we solve an equation, we use what kind of operation? I always say opposite or inverse. Inverse can mean opposite, it can mean undo, it can mean reverse. All of those things are just undoing what we did before, right? All right, so make sure you have these turned in with your playlist. Keep them in your binder until you're able to turn them in. And I hope you understood and you're ready for your skill check tomorrow.